I'll introduce now Jim Codling. Jim is an accumulator of degrees and experience. He has 2 PhDs, one in education, and he's got another in theology. He has 3 master's degrees and a bachelor's as well. From a professional standpoint, Jim's been an educator, a preacher. He's taught interesting courses at Mississippi State, writing for diversity, and I thought he and I talked about this, writing for thinking. And he said, well, that's good. He said, these kids, everybody should be able to think, right? So he said, but you'd be surprised how thinking was not of interest to some of them. He published numerous articles, books with Cambridge Press, Calvin Ethics, Eschatology, Jim, did I get that right? And Education.
Eschatology.
Thank you. Creative Arts, Forgotten Foundations of Education, etc. So he's got a great, tremendous background, which, and I'll just do an aside on this, having been involved with the society, I've had the opportunity to meet so many people with such diverse talent. It really is fun. You'd be amazed that among our group and folks that participate in what we do, what their background is, not only educationally, career-wise, professionally, hobbies. So it's been a lot of fun, and we've been able to put a lot of that talent to use around here, so which has really been great for us. So Jim, thank you. Come on up. Oh, I mentioned that Jim's here, and his wife Chris is accompanying his son Louis and girlfriend Alyssa.
It's very interesting that they're having this at the Gulfside Assembly today, because this was actually something that was taking place in the 1930s, in the Depression era. So this fits right in with what I'm talking about. If you get to go over there, you'll have some background. I was back a few years ago when they had the Olympics in Atlanta. Anybody remember that? I was actually a participant in the Olympics in Atlanta. Does that make you excited? I always wanted to be as an athlete, but I wasn't as an athlete. Instead, I made a presentation on Franklin Delano Roosevelt at a conference. And we were just part of that. The conference was in Shreveport. The Olympics were in Atlanta, but they included that so I could be part of the Olympics, I guess. But that stimulated my interest in the Depression. And when I came down here, I looked at some of the articles we have here and some of the references we have here. And one thing that we have is the old WPA book that was written in 1936. A team came down here and wrote all about Hancock County. Now, it's hard to read because I was missing a number of words. Can everybody hear me okay? It's missing a number of words, but the information is still there if anyone's really interested in going into deeper ideas on that. Also, if you look in the section that has all these books, all these houses that are according to street names, if you go through and you get Easterbrook and St. John Street, those are places where you'll find a number of houses that were built in the 1920s and 30s in the Depression era. So if you're interested in taking a tour up there, you can see a number of them. Now there's a number of them that are built new that look old, and there's a number that were built at that time that they've changed quite a bit to make them look more modern. But that was originally, a lot of those houses were there, and you can see the original ones if you go and look in those books. The major two types of architecture that you'll find there are the shotgun house. Everybody know what a shotgun house is? You open the front doors and the back doors, you shoot a shotgun, and it doesn't hit anything, it goes right out, right? That's a shotgun house. Those are something you would find on that street. And then also a craftsman style house. And craftsman style house is a little more complex. It was built a little more with craftsmen, built a little better. The shotgun houses were built very simply and cheaply just to give people a place to live because they didn't have them in the Depression. So that's a little bit of where things are in Bay St. Louis, and you'll find different sections in Waveland and other places that have the same kind of idea. Well, Mississippi suffered during the Great Depression perhaps more than any other state because it entered the economic depression when the Mississippi River flooded in 1929. And so we have a longer depression than anyone else in the nation here in Mississippi. Without insurance and government programs, people were left to their own means. And such means put Christine's uncle, Red, in reform school because all they ate were beans for breakfast, beans for lunch, and beans for supper. So he decided that was enough beans and he went and stole a pig. And that's why he went to reform school. So this is the kind of thing that made it difficult in Mississippi. Old accidents and health problems made work impossible for some, and with inflation, most incomes couldn't keep up with the cost of living. There was a fellow, William Comer. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was a politician from that era, representing Mississippi, and a fellow wrote him a letter from Picayune and said this basic thing that can't work, people around me can't work, can you do something for us? And so we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, go to the next slide there, Louis, FDR, who was elected, and he inaugurated in 1933. And with him, William Comer became the representative for the 6th District of Mississippi. Now, Comer was not a New Dealer. He wasn't really in favor with what FDR wanted to do. But he saw that there were desperate times, and he supported most of those New Deal measures. The answer for Roosevelt for the Depression was a stimulus program that would benefit this state. Senator Pat Harrison received about $15 million for Mississippi roads. Harry Hopkins spent more money in this state than all but 4 under the Works Progress administration. Almost $100 million would be spent under the New Deal in Mississippi by the summer of 1933. Now, not all the state had the same problems. Hancock County was unique in that it did not depend on cotton, and it had a special location on the coast, and it was near the bustling city of New Orleans, which it still is, by the way, in case you didn't know. However, all the counties did suffer depression, and all benefited from FDR's New Deal. In 1936, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act took 8.5 million acres of land out of production of cotton for the purpose of soil building. FDR's programs were to give forestry a boost. And so forestry became a big thing in Mississippi. Although there had been an extension forester hired at Mississippi State, or well, at that time it was Mississippi A&M, Mississippi State since 1926, the forestry department was not established actually until 1935. The growth of the forest industry in Mississippi was aided by programs that set up forest reserves and sent men to work planting those reserves. And you can probably see some of those things if you travel up Highway 55, you pass certain areas and you see all the pine trees planted in rows. You say, how did that go? Well, that was this conservation group that put those in. The timber industry has been important in Hancock County since colonial times. The needs for sailing ships, including tar, resin, or rosin, and masts and spars, could be met by the natural resources of the county and its position on the coast with Bay St. Louis. The Jordan and the Pearl rivers made excellent waterways for transportation. Although the disappearance of wooden sailing ships changed the market, new markets opened up with the needs for building materials. In 1936, approximately 2,000 barrels of turpentine and 7,000 barrels of resin were shipped from this county annually, every year that much. It reported that $100,000 worth, that's about 4 million feet of lumber, was produced annually by the county mills. The lumbering community also provided a new industry. In 1935, 10,000 cords of pine wood was shipped to New Orleans, Bogalusa, thank you, and Pascagoula, where they manufactured paper. This was a new industry, a new idea. It was logical also that lumber and furniture would go together, and thus we have Bay Furniture Company, which was established by Cueva and his son Ulysses. That's Victor Cuevas. And so, go to the next slide there, Louis. This didn't come out very clear, and a lot of my things didn't because I was trying to work with two computers. But this was the local government at that time, and the local government had the beat system. And this, if you want to go to our archives, Historical Society, you can find these kind of charts there. Go to the next one there, Louis. Okay. We had a number of financial institutions that grew up in this area during this time. And where everybody else seemed to be failing in banks, for some reason, our banks stayed pretty solid down here. And probably part of the reason is that money that came in from FDR's programs helped to keep those institutions viable. Plus, there were a lot of other things that people did. The program that employed young men to plant trees, build roads, and do other labor things was the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. That program was established in 1933 to give young single men work and education. And so part of my talk is going to be on education today, because that was one of the things that FDR felt was important in making us more of a viable economic and social community. In 1935, the Civilian Conservation Camp was established in Hancock County. As a result of this work, external boundary surveys were made, markers were placed, undesirable trees were removed, 33 miles of road were constructed, fire hazards were removed, lookout towers were erected, miles of telephone lines were extended. And it can be seen that much of the work of the CCC would do much to protect and strengthen the forest industry, as well as to improve the quality of life in the county. Since the removal of the camp, Hancock County has paid for the upkeep of 3 towers and telephone services. That's according to 1936. They don't do it anymore. They use planes now. But what they used to do is they had towers that were placed in strategic positions on the highest points, and they would triangulate where the fire would be. So one tower would spot it, another tower would spot it, another tower would spot it, and they could pinpoint where the fires were going to be. But you can, if you go up Highway 603 and towards the north, you'll find that there is you'll find a CC Road. That's still reminder of the work camp that was there. Well, of course, there are crops grown in the county, sweet potato industry, was supported by the county, and they paid for the services of a junior entomologist for sweet potato weevil. Anybody know what a weevil is? Everybody does. Okay, it's that thing with the long snout that destroys everything. When I was living up north, I heard of the weevil, and I always thought it was just affecting the cotton, but it affected the sweet potatoes as well. It's with the aid of the federal government that also the citrus cancer was eradicated from the state, and some progress was made towards the eradication of the Argentina and sweet potato weevil. You had pecans being grown down here. The Kenny Pecan Grove sold large quantities to New Orleans and points east, according to the records of the WPA. And we find that there was a diversification of crops grown here, which helped this area to stay viable. Although Hancock County could not be classified as a manufacturing center, its location made it important. One thing that changed in this time was the fact that this place, Bay St. Louis, became part of the country, you might say. For the longest time, it was separated by the Pearl River and the bay. And so, being that way, it was like an island in itself. But with the new roads that came through in the 1920s, and a new bridge that was built across the bay, it became connected to other places. That bridge is a very interesting story. It was right at the end of Almond Street there, and it crossed over, and it was a wooden bridge. And the unfortunate thing about a wooden bridge is that they burn. So young men apparently from Pass Christian would take their dates over to Bay St. Louis because this was a popular place for entertainment, as it is today. It's always, I guess we just have a good flavor for entertainment here. And they would be at the movie or a theater or some other activity, and then the bridge would burn, and they wouldn't be able to get home for curfew. Now, I know you don't know what curfew is. You're all too young for that, right? But in those days, they had curfews. Young ladies are supposed to be in by 10 o'clock or earlier, depending. And so the young men would not be able to make curfew. Now, I don't know if that was a lie on the young men's part, if they burned the bridge actually on purpose, but we know that there were many young men who got in trouble because they didn't bring their girls home on time, and they used the bridge as an excuse. But the fact that they were now having a highway going through this area, and they needed service stations. And although this is backwards, it says Porters. That's just my lack of expertise with a computer. And it's still over there on Ullman Avenue and Joe Williams' lot there. Porters is still there, and you can still see. This was actually a very interesting place in that it started in the 1930s, and it was a successful business. So, well, we here again went against the odds, and we had a successful business that started in the 1930s. My slides got out of order, so we'll skip over and come back to it when we get to it. But one of the industries that was very important was the Peerless Oyster Company. And if you're afterwards, if you want to look at that little tray in the back, the bottom coin is from the Oyster Company. And that was a coin that was used either for a bonus for somebody, or maybe for somebody got a refund, or they got that as a script. We don't know exactly, but want to go to that Peerless one? So the Peerless Oyster Company was one of those very important industries. This is located, if you know where the yacht club is today, that's where it was located. One of the most important, of course, important fish of course, is the shrimp. And during that time, shrimping was so popular or so well done that they didn't have to have shrimping seasons. They didn't have to have oyster seasons. They had a lot of stuff out in the coast, out in the ocean there. Nowadays, we're having difficulty trying to bring back the oyster breads, trying to bring back the population of shrimp, but that's what our pollution has done, you might say. Now we're coming to the next slide there, Lewis, and it's going back to where the slides, I put them out of order here. This was the bus station, and so you have buses as well going through Bay St. Louis and bringing tourists and bringing visitors to come through. This was Mrs. Porter's place. She had her chair right back here, and she did all her business from that bus station so she could keep her eye on everything going on. Apparently she's a really smart young lady, or maybe not so young, but anyway, she was a really smart lady, and she was able to develop a real good business there. Okay, well, let's go to the next slide there, Lewis. And this was something that was important for this county, important for the whole country, and that's why FDR made all of his programs have an educational component. And the reason was the Depression affected education. It affected where the students were. Next slide there, Lewis. Oh, it didn't come out very clear. But there were some questions that were being asked. One thing was it practical education or was it idealistic education that should be given? And educators, they seem to accept the progressive education. FDR said, no, I want to have a practical education. I want to educate students for jobs. And thus his programs like the CCC and the Works Progress Administration have young men who went out and worked for part of the day, and then, excuse me, and then they had a time in the evening where they did their education. Eddie says his dad, was your daddy was in the CCC?
Yes.
And he was at that camp up there?
He was at a camp in north central Mississippi.
Okay, so it wasn't at this one. But
No,
okay.
we weren't from here.
Okay. Anyway, the challenge of the Depression was that where would these students go and how would they deal with the Depression? People were worried that kids were having low morals. They didn't have jobs. They didn't have any money, so they got into trouble. So put them in education and they'll be all right. Right, teachers? Okay, next slide, Lewis. One of the problems that people faced or looked at that time was this idea of segregation. And in some counties, like our neighboring counties to the east, they had a small population of African American students, and so they shipped them out of their county to go to other schools. We didn't do that here. We're a little bit nicer, I think. But we didn't have a large black population, and still, although we were a little nicer than they were, our schools were second rate. Teachers were poorly educated. They were even more poorly paid. If you were a black teacher at that time, you basically were on subsistence level teaching. Now some teachers think you're still on subsistence level, right? Right, Eddie? Were you on subsistence level?
Definitely.
But my father, when he started teaching, I think he earned $350 a year. So that was subsistence. My uncle earned even less than that, but my dad was married, so that's part of the reason. Okay.
Ask me what my first
What your first paycheck was, Eddie?
I started in 1970, and my yearly pay, although we just got paid for 8 months, or 6, let me go back up, 10 months. And then we had to find something else to do the rest of the summer. because I wasn't going to save any of that up. My first paycheck was, no, my first salary was right at about $6,000 a year.
Not a lot,
And
huh?
it didn't go up.
Didn't
very
go up for
in
much.
my 30 years of teaching.
Okay, go to the next slide there, Lewis. One of the things that FDR said, let's have vocational schools. And so this is actually a vocational school. This is actually from Kiln. This is a vocational school that was up there in the Kiln. Go to the next one, Lewis. We'll try to go through these a little more quickly. This is Waveland School. They actually had a basketball team. Next slide there. Looked pretty young to me, but I guess as we get older, everybody looks younger. Is that right? Next slide there. This is another class from the Kiln. These guys all dressed up for their pictures. Usually they came to school in a little less of an attire. Some people didn't have shoes to wear. My dad tells stories of kids coming to having to share shoes in the one family. So the one day one kid would come with the shoes, the next day the other kid would come with the shoes. So next one. Part of the thing that Chris was talking about, or we're going to be sponsoring later on, is the St. Augustine's Seminary's anniversary. And this was being built in the 1920s, so in the 1930s it became the institution for the education of African American priests. It was recognized with high honors nationally for that. And it's still there, same place. Next one, Lewis. Bay High School was established and was the public education building that where education seemed to. We were proud of that. At least the articles I read in the newspaper said we were proud of our education. Another one, Lewis. Of course, religious education with St. Stanislaus, and the next one, St. Joseph's. These were very important because they brought in students from all over, and they provided a quality education, as they still do. Next one. Of course, education means you have to read, right? Liz is a reading teacher, an English teacher. And so we established our first library in Bay St. Louis in this little shack here. And if you go over to the library, we've been trying to get the library to change its name to celebrate this young lady. What's his name? Her name, Beverly?
I'm sorry.
Oh, you're not listening to me, Beverly?
She was asking me about the picture she wants.
Louise Crawford. Louise Crawford.
Louise Crawford. I was trying to improve to get you involved here.
The audience, I know.
And so we're trying to get the library to change its name, but we haven't been successful at doing that. Next one. Now you're wondering why I have the Hancock Bank here again. Well, the second floor of the Hancock Bank, they piled their 200 books that they had in the library for the library, and this was the second place that they had their library. And so that's one of the things that I saw was very important for the success of this county during the Depression, was the fact that we cooperated. We did things together. People all did. Next one. Tourism was a big important part, and I talked about that bridge and how a lot of people came over to Bay St. Louis to go to the theater. Well, also you had a number of tourists came from New Orleans and other places because this was a place where people felt safe from disease. And also there was the springs in that little creek that runs behind St. Augustine Seminary right now. Along that creek there were a number of springs, and people felt they had health benefits. Next one, Lewis. And there's that's the old theater, one of the old theaters that was there. Next one I put in for my wife. This is what they came to see. Everybody recognize them?
Yes. Stymie and Petey.
Stymie and Petey. And so that's one of the pictures that people came to see, and of course very popular then, and sometimes popular today. I got a couple of pictures. Next one, Lewis. of the houses in this area. This is a picture of the shotgun house. That's a picture of the next one, of an old Waveland house that during the Depression kind of went into disrepair, and that's what basically happened. Well, the thing about Bay St. Louis is that the coast and its people probably could have survived the Great Depression. Diversity and the ocean meant there'd always be a means of support for us. It was an old adage that a father had confidence in his new son if he had a cast net, because he would always be able to catch some fish. That was what was said down here anyway, and would always be able therefore to feed his family. Still, as Cobb points out, no towns more in the need of economic stimulus than those in Mississippi, the South and the nation's poorest state. Thus, it should be recognized that Hancock County, although different from the northern counties, benefited from the New Deal policies of FDR, and through them was better able to survive the hard times in the Depression era. Another interesting thing, I brought some of my wife's Depression glassware, and there's a picture back there. In the bottom of the picture, can you look at the bottom of that little measuring cup? Do you see a measuring cup there, or did I move it?
There's a measuring cup here.
Yeah, look on the bottom, and what does it say?
It says, what does it say? Kellogg.
It says Kellogg's. And the reason it says Kellogg's is because those Depression glassware pieces were put in boxes of material that was, in that case, a Kellogg's cereal box, had that cup in it. And so you got your utensils or your glassware when you bought cereal or sugar. Another thing was that we were very inventive. And this is an old sugar sack. Hard to say. I put a few pins of the Roosevelt era on there when he ran for office. But you know why these sugar sacks were so important? Yeah, you made clothing out of them, or in this case, a tea towel, wash towel. And so we were very inventive down here and did all those kind of things. Well, I ran out of time. In fact, I went over time, didn't I, Ron?
You're fine.
Okay. So anybody have any questions?
We'd all like to thank you.
Well, thank you.